as a crowd of thousands, full of children, gathered on the south lawn of the White House for the 141st annual Easter egg roll, the war within Donald Trump's mind over the Russia investigation raged on. Trump telling reporters gathered to cover the annual holiday event that no one on his staff ignores his orders and that he's not even a teensy tiny bit angsty about getting impeached as talk of impeachment stretches from the Democratic presidential primary campaign trail to Capitol Hill, where House Democrats are holding a major discussion on that very topic 1 hour from now.
Are you worried that your staff is ignoring your orders as the Mueller report portrays?
Nobody disobeys my orders.
Are you worried about impeachment, Mr. President?
Not even a little bit.
But as is often the case with Trump, the facts tell a very different story. The president and his former White House counsel, Don McGahn, are locked in a nasty back and forth over McGahn's testimony. McGahn emerging as a man who wore two hats for the 22 months of the Mueller probe, human guardrail to Trump's worst instincts and star witness to Robert Mueller. McGahn cited in the actual Mueller report more than 150 times, more than any of the hundreds of total witnesses. McGahn among the White House staffers bracing for retribution from the president. New York Times reports, quote, some of the witnesses named in the report who have departed the White House but rely on access to Mr. Trump for their livelihoods fear his ire. Some have begun calling current and former administration officials and others in the president's orbit to seek clues about Mr. Trump's state of mind. That's according to 4 special counsel witnesses. McGahn was targeted by the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, in a round of Sunday show appearances, including this one on Meet the Press.
Why is he so angry at Bob Mueller? Why is he so angry at Don McGahn?
Because they
Why
tried
is
to
he
frame
angry
him.
with the Russians?
Because
the Russians are the ones that have manipulated, have created the impression that his election was illegitimate.
Why wouldn't you be angry at someone who tried to frame you for a crime and accused you of treason when it is absolutely untrue? And
Don McGahn saved him. Why is the president angry?
Don McGahn didn't save him.
Don McGahn didn't carry out an obstruction
That wasn't
and
an obstruction.
saved him.
He could have
fired Mueller.
He had a perfect right to fire Mueller.
And in this every man for himself post-Mueller world, McGahn's lawyer this weekend issuing a rare statement which included a not-so-subtle dig at Giuliani's grasp on reality. Quote, it's a mystery why Rudy Giuliani feels the need to relitigate incidents the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General have concluded were not obstruction, but they are accurately described in the report. Don nonetheless appreciates that the president gave him the opportunity to serve as White House counsel and assist him with his signature accomplishments. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Phil Rucker, White House bureau chief for The Washington Post, former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg, Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for The Washington Post, with us at the table, Karine Jean-Pierre, senior advisor to MoveOn.org, and Associated Press White House reporter Jonathan Lemire. Let me start with you, Phil Rucker. This weekend was remarkable, only if you haven't been following Trump for the last 2 to 3 years. Trump wins and then goes on the attack to make clear that even he knows that he didn't win at all.
Yeah, Nicole, it was a happy Easter down in Mar-a-Lago. The president was so focused on this Mueller report, and privately he was really upset and pointing his ire at Don McGahn, the White House counsel, because he shows up in those footnotes again and again and again, revealing some very damaging scenes to Mueller and the investigators. But it's important to remember why McGahn cooperated so fully with the special counsel and why so many of the other White House officials cooperated. And that's because of a decision that Trump and his lawyers made at the outset of this investigation to fully cooperate. It was President Trump who waived executive privilege to allow his White House aides to sit for interviews and become witnesses to the special counsel, and a decision that was made at the urging of Ty Cobb and John Dowd, 2 of the president's lawyers early on, who felt that if these other witnesses were to cooperate, they could get away without having the president actually sit for an interview.
So, Chuck Rosenberg, that's the legal reason. But let's take a step back. The human reason is because Donald Trump acted obstruction-y 10 times. And Robert Mueller told us all about it, with dozens of witnesses corroborating all the president's bad behavior. And let me just read from the actual report, something that was reported this weekend the President of the United States hasn't done. So from the actual report, This is McGahn's recollection, was that the president directed him to tell Rosenstein, Deputy Attorney General, not only that conflicts existed, but also that Mueller has to go. McGahn spoke with the president twice and understood the directive the same way both times. In response to that request, McGahn decided to quit because he didn't want to participate in events that he described as akin to the Saturday Night Massacre. He told Priebus that the president had asked him to do crazy rhymes with hit, and informed Priebus and Bannon that he was leaving. Chuck, answer two questions for me. One, why wasn't this obstruction-y enough? If you're trying to fire the person investigating you because you are afraid that your crimes or misconduct will be discovered by the investigator, isn't that the essence of obstruction of justice?
Absolutely. It's obstruction-y enough, Nicole. We know, because we've talked about this a lot, that you don't have to complete the crime of obstruction in order to be culpable of it, right? Obstruction requires an endeavor. And so asking someone to destroy records or request that another person lie is obstruction of justice, even if they don't carry out that order. And so, you know, Rudy Giuliani, in a shocking development, is wrong again. McGahn didn't save the president from committing obstruction of justice. McGahn saved the president from completing the crime of obstruction of justice, but an endeavor is sufficient. And so it is absolutely obstruction. And frankly, the Mueller report lays out a very compelling case for obstruction, not just that incident, but many more, asking people to lie and directing the firings and asking for the unrecusal of other officials. So it's a damning report.
Let me ask you something, Chuck, because I think the rest of us have a clear understanding of how Don McGahn functioned inside the Trump White House, but I don't think any of us understands, as you must, how Don McGahn functioned as essentially an informant for Robert Mueller. Explain that to us.
Yeah, so McGahn was cited many times in the report and spent, as we know, 30 hours with investigators. You know, I was thinking about this. The president historically has used his lawyers to commit crimes, right? Roy Cohn, Michael Cohen. The president sees lawyers as a conduit to criminal conduct. And so maybe not surprising that he would turn to Don McGahn, his lawyer, in order to carry out these obstructive requests, except for one problem. McGahn isn't Roy Cohn, and McGahn isn't Michael Cohen. McGahn seems to be a stand-up guy. He was around the president when a lot of this was unfolding. Not surprising that the president would have tried to use him to carry out these acts of obstruction. And I guess the nice part of the story is McGahn didn't do it, kept faithful notes, and told investigators the truth when asked.
You know what? I wanted to whip around, but I'm going to stay with you, Chuck, because you've opened up an area that I don't know that we spent enough time drilling down into. Donald Trump, you just said Donald Trump used his lawyers to commit crimes. A close Trump ally and another witness in the Mueller probe said to me that Donald Trump's impulsivity will lead him to commit criminal acts over and over and over again. That will be the story of the Trump presidency. Let me read you one more section and just lay over your analysis over this flashpoint. This is from the Mueller report. Substantial evidence indicates that by June 17, 2017, the president knew his conduct was under investigation by a federal prosecutor who could present any evidence of federal crimes to a grand jury. McGahn explicitly warned the president that his biggest exposure was not his act of firing Comey, but his other contacts and calls and his ask regarding Flynn. Can you explain that to us? And again, explain how I think a lot of people, now that they're processing and taking in the Mueller report, and I've read the obstruction report, have a hard time understanding how it was neither an exoneration nor a recommendation to prosecute the president for obstruction.
Sure. Great question. So in order to obstruct something, right, there has to be a something to obstruct. In this case, it has to be an official proceeding. Mueller is appointed on May 17th, so certainly by June 17th, as the report makes clear. And by the way, you can read it for yourself. Anybody can read it in Volume 2, pages 77 to 90. Trump clearly knew that there was an ongoing investigation, and he clearly acted to interfere with it. So why can't that be charged as obstruction? Well, because Department of Justice policy precludes bringing charges against a sitting president. I think that policy, Nicole, is really important for another reason. I think it also acted to preclude the Mueller team from recommending charges against the sitting president. If you can't charge a sitting president because that brings a stigma and a burden to the presidency pursuant to policy, then it also makes sense that recommending charges would have the same effect. And so you have to separate what he did, which is commit a crime, an obstruction of justice, from what he can be charged with which is right now nothing. He's a sitting president, and so he can't be charged.
Aaron Blake, you wrote about Don McGahn. Let me just put up a graphic for our viewers, and if you're in the car, I'll walk you through this. Don McGahn is cited 157 times, Michael Cohen 136 times, Michael Flynn 87 times, Hope Hicks 73 times, and Reince Priebus 66 times. The people that told the story that Rudy Giuliani was railing against, that the president was railing against, are some of the president's closest aides: Don McGahn, Michael Cohen, Mike Flynn, Hope Hicks, and Reince Priebus. They're our narrators.
It's remarkable, and this is what I was really looking forward to in this report. Is we have seen so many of these stories told by presumably a lot of these same people, albeit anonymously, through newspapers that maybe a lot of people in this country who are on the president's side don't believe. What we had in this case was a circumstance in which those people were brought in by Mueller's team. They were compelled to tell the truth about these things, and then that was recorded for posterity. These are now things that are on the record as having been determined by law enforcement. I also think it's interesting that Don McGahn is such a central character here. I'm not going to be the first person to say that serving in the White House is sometimes a thankless job, but if there's one person in that White House who got something out of actually serving there, Don McGahn might be that person. They got tons of judges confirmed, Federal Society type judges. That was really a huge initiative for him. So for him to ultimately be the guy who is drawing the president's ire, maybe the guy who said some of the most damning things about the president, he had every incentive to read the best into the president's actions here, because he had a lot on the line when it came to the president being a successful president. And the fact that he ultimately chose to block the president from doing these things, chose to memorialize them because he was apparently troubled by these requests, I think that speaks volumes about what people behind the scenes thought about what the president was trying to do.
Phil Rucker, I will never forget a piece that you and I believe Ashley Parker and maybe another one of your colleagues wrote about the pressure cooker that was the Trump White House, maybe around the time that some of these interviews were underway. And I always thought that to mean that the president was about to blow. But you read the Mueller report, and it's clear that the whole place was about to blow. You can picture, I mean, the way it's written, it's written the way the three of you gifted writers write these pieces about the White House. McGahn drives into the White House. He's got his resignation. He packs up his things. His chief of staff is going to quit alongside him. Just talk about the delta between, I mean, you guys knew a lot. How much more did you learn in reading this account of McGahn's sort of dual existence, walking that tightrope?
Well, Nicole, we certainly learned new details, new dialogue, new elements to these scenes of what played out inside the White House. But the culture that Mueller depicted, the culture of dishonesty, of paranoia, of chaos, of ineptitude, of dysfunction, that's what we were documenting week after week after week of this presidency. And every time we wrote a story saying it's chaotic in there, or the president is raging, or the president's like a pressure cooker, I can't tell you how many times the White House staff would call and say, that's just not true. It's not, there's no chaos here. The president's calm. I mean, the day Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel, the White House aides were telling us the president is calm. He's handling this very soberly, and he knows he's going to be vindicated, and he's not worried about the investigation. Lo and behold, he's saying, this is the end of my presidency. I am effed, according to Robert Mueller's investigation. So it just speaks to the dishonesty.
Phil Rucker, it also speaks to the need in your newspaper and at our network for us to expand the style guides and the permissible language to cover. I mean, there is a piece, we knew he was crass, but there, you know, and if any of us who covered Access Hollywood tape had to figure out how to say grab him in the bleep and bleep whole countries and whatnot. I mean, there is a lewdness, a crassness that is very much revealed in this report.
Yeah, there really is. One of Donald Trump's favorite words is the F word, and that predates the presidency, and it certainly lives on during the presidency. And you don't hear in his public comments him curse very often. He's actually quite disciplined when it comes to not using that sort of language on the stump, although occasionally he will let that slip. But when he's not on camera, when he's not performing for an audience, he can be incredibly crass, incredibly crude, and incredibly direct with his staff, dressing them down when he feels it's necessary.
I want to get to what you're reporting today, Jonathan, but let me show you Chairman Nadler from the weekend on the topics of Don McGahn and impeachment.
We have to hear from Mueller. We have to hear from other people like Don McGahn, whom we're going to call. We have to get the entire report, including the redacted materials, so we can evaluate it, and so the American people can know what was going on and can make judgments.
Do you think this is impeachable?
Yeah, I do. I do think that this, if proven, which hasn't been proven yet, some of this. If proven, some of this would be impeachable, yes.
All right.
Obstruction of justice, if proven, would be impeachable.
And you're going to go about to see if you can prove it?
Well, we're going to see where the facts lead us.
Following the facts is something that the Trump White House is allergic to. And don't, again, and this is something my colleague Rachel Maddow says, don't listen to what they say, watch what they do. Today, they're suing Elijah Cummings in his pursuit of the facts.
That's right. First of all, though, as a representative of the AP, I can talk about the curse and the style guide. I can make that pitch to the powers that be.
Do we need to re-examine it to cover Trump?
Maybe we do. But yes, in terms of what's happened today, it's a piece of a larger puzzle. But the Trump organization has filed a lawsuit against Elijah Cummings, trying to stop their efforts to investigate some of the financial dealings of the president and the Trump organization. Their argument is it's too broad-based, it's a fishing expedition, that they're casting too wide of a net, and so on. So not only is that likely going to stall things, and that process will be delayed for quite some time, but it goes to show you how this White House is going to combat what the Democrats are trying to do now that they control the House of Representatives. They are stalling on getting them answers for the security clearances. Like, how did Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, how did they get those clearances? The White House is pushing pause on that. Tomorrow is the new deadline for the White House, the president's attorneys, to turn over his tax returns to Congress. The deadline was postponed once already. Tomorrow's the new one. Nicole, don't hold your breath. Probably not going to happen tomorrow either. This is how they're going to do. They're going to fight. They're going to stall. They're going to obfuscate. And what we saw as an example of that, as always, is Rudy Giuliani on the Sunday shows. We saw it acting as a human smokescreen yet again, and pointing to, you played the clip about, that it wouldn't be wrong to get information from Russia. And again, that's a directive, according to our reporting, that comes right from the top. This is the president, though the Mueller report, we've talked about the objectionable parts of it, but Robert Mueller himself did not conclude a conclusion. He did not conclude obstruction. The president could have walked away. He can't do that. We saw this weekend. He's fuming about Don McGahn. He sends Rudy Giuliani to the Sunday shows to fight on that too, to defend what happened, because they simply cannot ever admit a mistake. They can never let a slight go by, and instead it ends up just relitigating the same thing as they fight and fight and fight going forward.
I think the Democrats, Karine, are on solid ground in terms of pursuing the facts. And I watched very closely what Chairman Nadler said. And they're not racing. I mean, I think Speaker Pelosi's warning was we don't race toward impeachment as the means, but if you pursue a fact-finding effort as the means and the end leads you there, that's out of our hands. Do you have the, how do you evaluate Chairman Nadler there?
Well, I thought the most striking part about it is when Chuck Todd asked him about impeachment, and he thought about it, and it was like kind of a deafening silence, and he said yes. And I think that's key there, because Nadler, as we know, is very meticulous, and all of them are. And so when he said that, I thought, okay, yes, you guys know you have ground to stand on, and he needs to put McGahn, right, and other key witnesses. McGahn was at the center of Trump's obsession of obstructing, and you cannot let that go. They have to do their constitutional duty to get to the bottom of it. I'm in the place of let's move with the impeachment proceedings. I think it's time. I mean, you cannot come away from reading 448 pages of Mueller's report and not say, oh my God, like we need to move forward here. here.
I think that's right. Phil Rucker, what about just the optics of seeing Don McGahn, the president's former White House counsel, and if you read the obstruction report, you know what the words would be that would come out of his mouth, but it's always different to see that on television. The president, in his own mind, a TV producer at heart. Is there any trepidation about seeing these White House staffers articulate what they describe in this report in live hearings on Capitol Hill?
You know, Nicole, it'll be very different to see this play out live, in full, unedited on Capitol Hill. It's one thing for them to sit for these lengthy interviews, and Mueller and his team sort of, picked and choose which elements of those interviews to include, which pieces of the dialogue to put into the narrative of that report. If McGahn sat for 30 hours, he had a lot more to say than what we read in the Mueller report. But if he's testifying on Capitol Hill for 6 hours, for 7 hours, for 8 hours, a lot's going to come out of his mouth, and he'll be asked a lot of questions from lawmakers that could cover the gamut when it comes to politically embarrassing things about this president. The questioning would not necessarily be limited to the facts of the episodes under review by the special counsel's team. So an open testimony like this is much more treacherous, I think, for these former White House officials, and no doubt they're going to try to do what they can to avoid having to do that.
All right, Phil Rucker, thank you for spending some time with us and for all your great reporting over the weekend.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.